This happened to me 7 years ago when I planned on hunting with my two uncles. I had visited them at their cabin half an hour from Anchorage, Alaska, coming all the way up from Little Rock. The flight alone felt like an eternity, with only one stop in a Canadian city called Edmonton. My uncles, Billy and Roger, never seemed to have gotten used to the cold. They always told me that they only feel at home when they're hunting, drinking, or a mix of both. Both of them had temporarily moved to this colder city for work, oil paid, and it did more than it would in Texas. Because they worked in the coldest months of the year, they always made sure they would hunt, drink, and spend many a night in the comfort of a hot tub. Working for a call center, I craved the means to escape the corporate BS and truly feel at one with nature. My uncles respected it. My parents did not, especially not my mother. Bears are out there, among other things, and if it wasn't bad enough, you choose to keep yourself in the company of those drunk buffoons, was the last thing I heard my mom say to me before I hung up on her and boarded the plane. I somewhat understood. She was worried about me. But the time my father resented his younger twin brothers for their lifestyle of alcohol. There were definitely bears out there, but there was something else, something bigger. The first 3 days were meeting and catching up. We went ice fishing on day 3. Didn't catch much. However, Uncle Roger was adamant that our hunt in a few days would be more fulfilling, and that the elk in the area were massive. On my 4th night there, I was in their hot tub, which had a gorgeous view of the nearby lake. I felt luxurious, and my hungover uncles had left for which I could only assume was more moonshine. With a lemonade in one hand, I slid back into bliss. The contrast of frigid Alaskan nights and a decent hot tub is the stuff of legends. The aurora borealis, or the northern lights, glimmered brightly over the lake in the snow. I couldn't believe Uncle Roger described this as your normal Tuesday night. Unfortunately, the tourist dream was cut short, and a nightmare began. I heard a strange shriek in the distance, not thinking much of it. The shriek cried again, louder, closer. It didn't sound like a mammal, but like a wounded bird. I straightened myself up as I noticed a figure black out parts of the northern lights, but it was hard to see what was going on. I heard the shriek again, this time directly above the house. I froze solid, and then there was a loud crash, and then something dropped onto the roof above the hot tub and slid off into the snow. I called for Roger and Billy, hoping at least one would hear me while I waited to the other side of the tub to get a better view of whatever got dropped onto the house. The first thing I noticed is that it stunk of blood. That made me concerned already, hoping that it wasn't one of my uncles somehow. I peeked over the nice wood railing separating the house from the snow to find the top half of a very large elk. Something had dropped an elk onto the property. This poor animal did not die peacefully, judging by its missing rear body and multiple puncture wounds. I stared at the poor animal like how you would witness a train wreck. I couldn't take my eyes off of it. I was scared to move, but from these sounds of things, whatever left it here wasn't coming back for it. Uncle Billy managed to barge through the door to the hot tub first. He was fully dressed and navigated around his tub towards me. I noticed a bowie knife strapped to his loose belt. Uncle Roger followed shortly, a crossbow in his hand. They said that I sounded frightened, and they were ready for a fight. They immediately noticed the carcass and began to ask me a million questions. Are you hurt? What did you see? The usual suspects. One question stuck out from the rest. Did you notice which way the thing was flying? My uncles must have known about this thing before. I was scared to think about if they had seen it before. I told them that I noticed a shape in the sky facing the lake. For a moment, they both looked determined for a pair of hungover men. They calmed me down and I got inside. They took what they could from the elk, and Uncle Billy dropped off the remains onto the nearby highway. I managed to sleep that night more than anticipated. Coming down from the fear probably tired me out more than I suspected. My uncles didn't start their mornings drinking an old-fashioned with breakfast. They explained to me that they had been noticing animals on and around the property for a year or so now. Billy had heard shrieks before, and Roger had admitted to seeing what looked like a giant bird in the night sky on a few occasions. Both of my uncles didn't bother to deal with the problem until now, because they would look suspicious going through the snow with guns outside of hunting season. But this time was different. They planned on taking me hunting with them to kill the massive bird. Roger and Billy both insisted that hunting at night was more logical, since this bird creature never made any issues in the daytime. I questioned their opinion, but after they promised I would try some of their moonshine that they'd been experimenting with in the cellar, I was on board. Every 14-year-old had fantasies of drinking, of course. We loaded up our black powder rifles, our trusty and heavy winter apparel, and trundled through the snow like the Three Musketeers. The sun was just passing the horizon when we made our way out into the foothills, where this bird had been flying towards. It didn't take long before we found our first clue. A frayed feather, about the size of my forearm, was hanging from a tree. My uncles fished it from the tree, as I wasn't tall enough for the job. They stared at it, fascinated. I forget which one, but I know one of them kept the feather. We knew that we were on the right track, and we pressed onward. We began to fast approach a steep mountain face about 20 minutes later. To make matters less than ideal, it began to snow. We weren't lost, but we couldn't go much further as it would be too slippery to scramble up the cliff. We decided that standing out in the cold wasn't the best location, and we took a 5-minute walk to a nearby pond that had just begun to freeze. Roger brought a winterized hunting blind, and we took shelter in it. It was quite big on the inside, the perfect way to stay warm and hunt at the same time. I got a little giddy as I got myself comfortable. We decided that we would wait out some of the harder snowfall, and so we did, seemingly forgetting why we were out hunting in the first place. Billy was about to crack open some of the promised moonshine when he noticed something from out of one of the peak holes. A large black figure took flight off the top of the cliff face. The three of us began to get our weapons at the ready, and Billy tried to keep his eye on it. It was coming in our direction, descending below the tree line. I was freaking out as I felt the flap of its wings push wind against the blind. The wind itself shook the blind, almost knocking it over. My blood was probably colder than the snow as I clutched my rifle tightly against myself. My uncles insisted I stay quiet, and I complied. I'd put in my earplugs and they followed suit. We could track the location of this thing by where the flapping noise came from. They were hefty and soon they stopped, and I heard crunching in the snow maybe 40 yards away. On the other side of the pond, a massive black bird that resembled an eagle walked towards the freezing water's edge. It was tall, at least 7 feet, and I can only imagine how massive its wingspan was. What was strange about this bird were its glowing eyes. They were bright, like they resembled electricity. It didn't seem to notice us, or it didn't care, and it slammed its mighty beak through the layer of ice and began to drink from the pond. It was as graceful as it was terrifying. Billy and Roger both began to quietly bicker over who was going to shoot it. Eventually, it was Roger's shot to take, and he aimed down the sights. He fired, landing a direct hit on what I could only describe as its back. The bird roared, though I'm not sure if it was louder than my uncle's gun. It stammered around and then leapt across the pond. I hid as best as I could in the blind, cowering behind the backpacks. Roger abandoned his gun and attempted to hide with me. I could hear the massive bird approaching the blind, each step sounding louder and heavier. I could see its hot breath make its way into the blind. As it got closer, I felt my hair stand up like static. Billy, on the other side of the blind, did a battle cry and fired blindly at the bird with his round. Fortunately, my earplugs were still inside my head. The bird shrieked and hopped away. We heard its massive wings flap and the beast took off. I would have imagined that Roger's shot broke a wing. We were all on a daze, but eventually we got our stuff together and quickly exited the blind and ran back towards the house, constantly taking looks over our shoulder. Nothing came, thankfully. After an adrenaline-fueled half hour of running through snow, we charged into Roger and Billy's place and locked the doors and closed all the windows. We were still in all of our winter gear before we even noticed that we were safe in a warm house. The moonshine that we shared got me feeling even more sick than I had already felt from the encounter. After letting it all out in the bathroom, I did my best to fall asleep. It took me a lot longer, and I continuously peeked out the window looking for the massive bird to come back with a vengeance before exhaustion put me to sleep. The next morning, we skipped breakfast and swiftly went back into the foothills to retrieve any backpacks that we had left. They were missing from the spot near the pond. We cautiously made our way over to the cliff face where we had seen the thing come from. We saw the blind, and most likely our backpacks too, torn to pieces and hanging from high up on the cliff. I left my uncle's place 2 days later and spent those last 2 days sitting in the hot tub, afraid, or doing research on what the heck that thing that we saw was. Given by its size and definition, I have reason to believe that Billy and Roger were living close to a thunderbird. I didn't buy the superstition at first, but according to other witnesses, it's my greatest guess. It turns out that my uncles didn't want to stick around either. In around a month's time, they asked to be transferred to Texas for work. They ended up making about the same amount of money, and they were so close to home that it was nice. Billy and Roger mended fences with my father, and my parents didn't have to stress me jumping across the country to see them. I'll give the encounter some credit, as I've been going to school for biology and ornithology. I hope to use science to discover more about the legendary Thunderbird.